Well, firstly, thanks for doing this. This is like a very busy time of the year. Usually not a time where people are, gratuitously giving their time away.
Yeah.
for
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. But, for us right now, I think we're mostly through the craziness, to be honest,
yeah,
because roasters like yourselves, you released coffee a week or two ago, and now we're just kind of waiting to get through the holidays. But I mean, in a way, it's great because you know we can kind of spend time with family and not be too stressed about meeting deadlines or anything. So mostly
yeah,
right now, I'm just kind of preparing for 2022 at this point.
right. Yeah, whatever that looks like.
Exactly, whatever
Right.
that looks like for sure.
Well, Kyle, let me introduce you as because I wanted to introduce you as from one vastly important and largely overlooked role within the coffee industry, and that's as an importer. I think
Yeah,
importers are the connective tissue between the coffee consuming and coffee producing world.
yeah,
Um, there's been a lot of like marketing developments over the last 15 years of specialty coffee, romanticizing roasters and coffee producers, but importers, the people with kind of boots on the ground, so to speak,
yeah,
people that, for better or for worse, have direct contact with producers and
yeah,
and coffee drinkers, the coffee market, um, the people who build relationships, either meaningful, equitable, and substantive, or merely transactional and exploitative. Those are all importers, and they
yeah,
really don't make their way into conversations, even with more accountability or maybe a little bit more visibility with regards to transparency. Even still, I feel like roasters take a little bit much credit for some of the for some of the work on the sourcing side. And Osito is a company, we're just really proud to work with. I think it's a relatively new. I mean, we're a relatively new company, but it's a relatively new relationship,
yep.
at least with the depth of relationship we currently inhabit for us, and it's one that I'm really proud of and really excited about. Um, so
Well,
I'd love
the
I'd
feeling
love
is
for you.
mutual, absolutely. Even though we've only started working together in the last few months, it's been great to get to know you personally and Jamal a little bit as well, and having being able to host you in Colombia was just amazing. But
Yeah, it
to
was
be
an
able to kind
incredible
of
trip.
build a couple different supply chains across a couple different countries has been great.
For sure. Absolutely. On that note, just for anyone who is watching or listening, I'd love if you could introduce yourself
Yeah,
and Osito for that matter.
yeah, of course. So my name is Kyle Bellinger. I am one of the founders of Osito. Osito is actually two different companies. We have an exporting company based in Garzon, Huila. There I have a partner, Jose Javier Losada. He and I, we are the co-founders of Osito Global. um, and here in the U.S., we have an importing operation with a small staff, and we also have kind of a satellite office in the Netherlands at the moment. Hopefully, formalizing that into an actual legal entity in the new year. But for right now, we are just two companies. And when we started the business, the idea was really just to source Colombian coffee. My background was in roasting. Jose's background was both in farming as well as in quality control. He was the cupper for a large cooperative for a long time, and we had someone create a relationship on our behalf, help facilitate kind of like the farmer roaster connection. Um, and so when we started this business, the idea was to do the same thing, but for lots of roasters, for lots of farmers, and to make the supply chain as short and as transparent as humanly possible. And I'm happy to say that starting in early 2018, we were able to do that for a lot of companies, with specifically with Colombian coffee producers and roasters, at least here in the U.S. at that time. But as things grew, we realized, especially as an import company, well, we can go buy coffee anywhere we want. We can go to Ethiopia and buy coffee and import it and do the same thing, even though we can't actually have a legal entity on the ground in Ethiopia. We can source coffee in similar ways as long as we find good export partners, good producers that we want to work with. And so we've been able to do this, kind of replicate this model in other areas. Ethiopia is hands down our second largest country of origin. We do source quite a bit of coffee from Ethiopia. And I've been working there for quite a while, but now we are working in Mexico, Brazil, a little bit in Peru, a little bit in Honduras, as well as working with the Long Miles Coffee Project, who are founded in Burundi, but now have operations in Kenya and, fingers crossed, Uganda as well. And so we are their import partner, both in the east coast of the U.S. as well as in Europe. And so now we are on the ground sourcing coffee in all of these countries, and just trying to create short supply chains, trying to create transparent and sustainable supply chains, trying to kind of be, I would say that what we do is not necessarily reinventing the wheel. But it's, in my opinion, what we do differently from companies who I would consider our competitors is that we take to heart kind of like the buzzwords that we use, sustainable being one of them. That word doesn't mean anything. The word gets, planted on so many different aspects of what we do, environmental sustainability, economic sustainability, social sustainability. And so those are the kinds of things that we take to heart and really want to make sure that we're not just saying it, because it's very easy to say okay, there's a market price for coffee. We paid a little bit above that. That's sustainable. That means we did our job. We can pat ourselves in the back and be done. But that's just not the case. I mean, you look at coffee prices now in Colombia, they are literally 2.5 times what they were, just the market price. Is 2.5 times what it was when we started the business. Yeah. And so just because we're paying a little bit above that, does that mean that it's sustainable? Nah,
that's such an important thing. I mean, one other thing about, which I actually admittedly only kind of realized or was clued on to after we already started working together. But I think, you've had a markedly vocal presence on social media. I have a lot of opinions about social media. I have my own way of engaging with social media, but any way that I can imagine social media being a positive thing is close to how I think you engage with it, with pretty substantive, direct commentary.
I appreciate that. I think there is a lot of opacity in how businesses like ours tend to deal. And for us, our biggest asset is just being as transparent as possible. And in this day and age, Instagram is the tool to do that. It doesn't always come out in casual emails back and forth about, hey, what coffees are coming in. And so our newsletters, our Instagram posts, the stories, that's where we can kind of shed light on what the real situation is in a lot of coffee producing countries who are dealing with hosts of issues, especially right now. That is the way to kind of get in front of people and to explain this is the real situation and this is how we feel compelled to deal with it.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned earlier that you're not reinventing the wheel, but either directly, as I've been privy to somewhat, or indirectly through some of the other people you work with, like Long Miles, there is a lot of innovation happening. I think there is a lot of thinking that's going on with you and your team regarding how to engage, how to structure. I mean, I do think it is important to not just engage with coffee industry as status quo. I mean, if we thought that the coffee industry was perfect or fantastic the way it is, not mired in problematics as it is, then status quo would be fine. But there's another thing about Osito that I think is really important is I really do think, and have heard from you directly, have seen now, luckily, some of the things that are happening to really rethink what those, again, how those supply chains work, how that connectivity really manifests, and what opportunities exist outside of like the kind of standard flow of resources within that economy. And so I think that's really important. I'd love to talk about Colombia for a second, because, it's obviously a place, that you've called your second home. And like every coffee producing country in the world, it is often reduced to oversimplified generalizations with regard to how it tastes and how it functions. And
totally.
Colombia, like almost every country, is actually a regional. It's a regional representation. And so, we can use this a little bit to segue into one of the reasons that I wanted to talk to you, which are our Divino Nino coffees. But first, Suaza is not a region that I know much about and haven't seen much from. But I'd love to hear you speak about the regionality of Colombia and the regional representation in Colombia, if that's even a meaningful distinction, because sometimes even, and I've seen, we've seen this across other countries as well, where even regionally, it actually is much more relevant to talk about producers or factories or mills than it is even to talk about regionalism.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because it's something that I think about a lot, because, for so long, when people bought Colombian coffee, specialty coffee roasters, quote unquote, going back to the beginning of specialty coffees were kind of branded as Colombia. And then people got a little bit more savvy, and they're like, okay, this is from Huila. Huila is a big place. There are, I think, 30 some odd municipalities.
You just need to sit in a van and traverse Huila to know how big of a place it is.
Yeah, I mean, in these 30, I think it's 31, I don't know, I could be wrong. I think only one municipality in Huila does not produce coffee. And then within the municipalities, there are neighborhoods called veredas, where, just because we buy a lot of coffee in this one part of Suaza, but we also buy coffee from other parts of Suaza that are not lumped in with those coffees. Those are separate things. And so for me, I think we're very much still in the phase of coffee roasters labeling coffees as Huila. And when I see that, I'm like, well, where in Huila? Like, tell me more. Nataga is really far away from San Agustin, and the cultures of coffee are completely different, and the varieties being grown are different. And maybe that's not obvious to kind of the novice coffee buyer, but once you dig into like the particulars, you realize that all of these places have these kind of beautiful nuances to them. And it's a big reason why, Huila is the largest producer of coffee on the departmental level in Colombia. But within that, there's just so many different things. And it's why we've decided, okay, we can dig in here and see lots of diversity, even from this one department. Yeah. But that said, I mean, go ahead.
I was just going to say, there's no doubt there's a degree of arbitrariness with those demarcations, right? Like where were we, if I can remember correctly? If we were looking out as a group of judges onto El Pital and looking at Valle de Cauca.
Yeah.
Right. And it was right there. It was, they were right beside each other. And those were things that would be labeled as regionally different on a bag. But we were in El Pital in Huila, and how far away was, I don't know, like Acevedo from where we were, like far away. Like
you were way closer to Cauca at that point.
Yeah. So it is a little bit arbitrary.
Yeah, it is. But then, but even that distinction between, I mean, where we were in El Pital and La Plata over the border into Cauca, right now, I can't go to Cauca. because it's deemed too dangerous. Because there's a lot of closed groups there, a lot of ex guerrillas. There's a lot of reasons why it is unsafe to just cross that relatively arbitrary border.
Right. Well, some of those borders are a little less arbitrary, I suppose.
Yeah. But the point being is that there's so much diversity throughout all of Colombia, and Huila is just one piece of that. You cross the border into Cauca or into Tolima, and certainly, from a profile perspective, some of the coffees can taste very similar, but the cultures are very, very different. I would say it's more similar between Tolima and Huila, but even there's very clear distinctions. Yeah. And then you go further north into like the coffee axis, like these bigger farms, very, very different profiles, very different culture of producing coffee. And then you get up into, Antioquia and further north into into the Sierra Nevada, like it's just completely different. And how these things kind of get lumped together in one, succinct Colombia on a coffee bag is like, it's mind blowing to me. Like, how could you do that with French wine? You could never legally, you could not do that.
Exactly. And for us, and there's so many similarities there. Some of them are varietal, and some of them are processing based, and some of them are terroir, or the vinification equivalent of how that coffee, when all of the tradition of how that coffee is like picked or processed or dried, and everything affects the individuality of those offerings. I mean, case in point, when we were judging the Copa de Occidente, and how many coffees did we try, and how different were all those coffees? I mean, maybe for a moment there felt like there was a common thread, and that very quickly dissipated.
Yeah.
I care. I mean, even coming from like a wine tasting background, I am constantly looking for ways to group regions' tastes together, and it's just heuristics, right? It's just to be able to speak to something tangible. But honestly, I think it's pretty elusive. The more time I spend in coffee, and because it's a moving target, the coffee industry is moving. What Colombian coffee tastes like now, for example, what kinds of processing were being done for the coffees I think we tasted, I think it's changing. We saw producers fermenting coffee in ways that I don't think we would have seen. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we would have seen
even just 2 or 3 years ago, I think it was different.
For sure.
I think information, for better or worse, spreads a lot faster. And, to be clear, some things that I wish wouldn't spread seem to spread much faster than even that. But the point being is that, the internet makes the world a very small place. And people can learn new ways of doing things, which in some ways is really, really great. And, as we saw with some of the farms we visited in La Plata, that, people are doing things that they wouldn't have done a couple years ago. And sometimes the results are pretty fantastic.
Yeah, for sure. Why don't we talk a little bit, because I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you, in addition to just catching up, because it's been a while since we're away together, is to talk about these two coffees from Divino Niño. Again, Suaza. I've heard you talk about Suaza before.
Yep.
It's not a region that I have, subregion that I've experience with, and again, just hearing about the Divino Niño project, it was a project we wanted to start engaging with, and so we started with these two coffees, this pink bourbon and this geisha, but they're a little bit different than I think some of the pink bourbons and geishas on multiple levels, on a structure and a production level. So I'd love for you to speak a little bit to Suaza, but also what brought you to Suaza to begin with, but also what then led to your engagement with the Divino Niño project.
So Suaza, for those who are unfamiliar with the landscape of Huila, is in the southeast of Huila, right on the border of Caquetá. So right on the eastern Cordillera. It sits right up against the mountain, and right on the other side is a different department. It is an area that has had some level of international recognition due to a couple of producers who did well in the Cup of Excellence many years ago. Otherwise, Suaza is largely overlooked. It's not as big. It's overshadowed by like municipalities like Pitalito, which is the largest producing municipality in Huila, which is only hour and a half away. It's it produces a huge amount of coffee, sometimes really, really great coffee, and there's an airport there. So for buyers who want to fly in from the US or Canada or the UK, like they can drop right into Pitalito, cup some coffees, and get back on a plane. And for Suaza, it's just a little more off the beaten path. But for us, the reason specifically why we started working in Suaza and why it's still probably the biggest origin that we work with in Colombia is because my partner is from there. Jose was born in a little town in Suaza called Picuma, and not only was he born there, his parents, most of his siblings still live there, and he and I own a farm there together, and that's where our relationship started. So on my first trip to Colombia several years ago, I found myself in Picuma. I was told that I was the first gringo to ever spend the night there. Wow. Whether or not that's true, I don't know. But I will say, as we sat out on the front porch, it did draw a lot of attention as to why there was some white dude hanging out, especially one that couldn't speak any Spanish at the time. But for me, it Suaza specifically kind of feels like a second home. Because I've spent so much time there, because we literally own land there. That said, Divino Nino is a different vereda, so a different neighborhood within Suaza. It's actually about an hour away from where our farm is in Picuma.
Oh wow!
And the reason we started there was simply like when we started the business, we were looking for producers to work with and where we want to kind of put down roots. And I just asked Jose, I was like, are there any associations in Suaza that need a buyer, that need someone to come in and buy their coffee at good prices and market them? And he was like, yeah, there's this one group, but they're really disorganized, but I'll reach out and see what's going on. And so he reached out to the group that's called La Cooperativa del Divino Niño del Horizonte, which is at the time was a producer group of, I think, 20 or 25 people. Maybe some were not super active, maybe some were, but they've been around for, I want to say, close to 15 years, probably more than that at this stage. They've had, different leadership. They've worked with various exporters, various importers, but nothing has ever really stuck. And so, we went in and we met with them. And I remember, meeting with them the first time. And the current managing director, her name is Edilma. I remember she's a very strong woman. I would say she is intimidating in a way. And I was like, man, I don't think she wants to work with us. But I think it was more that like they had worked with people who came in and said the same stuff.
For sure.
And then disappeared. And she wanted to know that we were serious. And at this stage, she and Jose have a great relationship, and she is, welcoming and soft. But like at that moment I was like, oh man, like she was hammering us with some questions, like, what do you really want out of this? Mm-hmm. And I would say after our first full year of working together, it kind of like those edges kind of softened a little bit.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and so since day one, we've been working with this group, and that's also kind of dovetailed into working with another small little group in that area who are distinct. But this is like a small group of organic producers in that same area, as well as some of those family members kind of outside both of the groups. So it's starting to sprawl a little bit, but it's mostly just because there are really, really great coffees there, and people who want to work with buyers who want to stick around for the long term. And that's kind of what we do, through thick and thin, through, high prices or low prices. We want to be there because for us, it's about the relationship. It's about the long-term thing. And it's, we have now clients who want those coffees year over year, and it's our responsibility to maintain that supply chain. And right now what that means is paying what we would consider, ridiculously high prices to make that happen.
Yeah.
Are they ridiculously high? No. I mean, right now,
we have our
growers' costs are so high that they're barely covering those costs. Like, they're not making more money than they were last year.
Yeah.
But, compared to years past, from the outside looking in, it would look ridiculous.
Yeah.
But it's just what we have to do now.
Yeah. On these specific coffees, Subtext as a project is really about, we've really foregrounded single producer coffees.
Yeah.
That's probably not even doing justice to it, because it's exclusively that. Not only are we a single origin, it's why we don't blend coffees ever. We don't roast different degrees. We just don't. For us, we want structurally to build as much connectivity with producers, past us, and to producers, the work that importers do, the work that producers do. And so we really focus on single producer coffees. And that can be a pretty deceiving term for a couple of reasons, right? Like, what is a producer? When a lot of, obviously, the most obvious example is Kenyan and Ethiopian coffees, which almost never. We have a few anomalies, which are single producer Ethiopian coffees, but it's rare. It's very rare. And we've engaged with this other idea of community lots, and you don't have to really forego the important work of humanization and decommodification that comes with, the single origin mentality, by engaging with what a community or a growers group produces. And, that's what we're talking about when we talk about Divino Nino. We're talking about community lots. And I'd love to hear your take on that. I mean, what we do have are, usually, I found anyway, that community lots are blended in the sense of varieties.
Yeah.
But this is a bit different. Yeah. And so I'd love to hear what that took.
Yeah. So, I mean, let's talk about community lots in general first, and why we do it. The reason is because the average farm size in Huila is the average farm size in Colombia is less than 2 hectares, which doesn't produce a lot of coffee, And unless you are a very small roastery who only buys like Colombian coffee, like you need more coffee, basically, to support producers in a meaningful, to supply your needs, but also support producers in a meaningful way. And so, like, for example, take a producer from Divino Nino, Dane Gomez. He's got 1.1 hectares of land. This kid produces a really, really great coffee, but it's like 5 or 6 bags a year. Mm-hmm. And it's like, okay, that's great. But it comes in like dribs and drabs throughout the whole year. So like we might have like 30 kilos in May. We might have 60 in June. We might have maybe a full bag in August at some point. And like, in order for those 6 bags total from the whole harvest to land in good condition, they got to ship pretty quickly. But shipping 30 kilos in May, who does that serve? Like, for us, it's a logistical nightmare. For sure. Unless there's a roaster who really, really wants it, it's also a logistical nightmare for them.
Yeah.
So why not pay him the same price we pay him, as always, and just find a good way to blend it? Yeah. For him, the most important thing is the price paid and the timing of the payment. And obviously, when there are times when coffees are absolutely exceptional that we would never even think about blending it, and in those instances, we're happy to put a producer's name on it, sell it as a single producer lot, pay them as much money as we possibly can pay them. But otherwise, like, logistically, it doesn't make sense for anybody. Yeah. And so, in most cases, in the 3 or 4 kind of big regions that we work in, we create, 84, 85 point community lots, 86 plus community lots. And, anything that's really exceptional, 87 plus, we tend to separate out as single producer lots. But then there are these cases of small amounts of single varieties, like geishas. Like, these are usually very high scoring coffees, 87 plus, 88 in some cases. But often they are very, very small lots. We've cupped literally 7 kilos of geisha being delivered at a time. And like, what can I do with that?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, you guys, is that a 15 kilo loring behind you?
Yeah.
Like 7 kilos of a geisha in there. Like, it's not even a full batch. Like, it doesn't work.
One half batch of roast. Yeah. No profiling. Yeah. We're just going to Hail Mary.
And 7 kilos of parchment. We're talking about 5 kilos of green coffee.
Yeah,
like,
it's true.
It's really not a meaningful amount for anybody.
Yeah.
And so, and that said, it's going to be 5 kilos this month, another 5 the next month, another 5 a few months from now. And so, for us, it just kind of made sense to start creating these community lots of single varieties, specifically of geisha and pink bourbon. I don't think we've done anything else at this stage. But geisha, because one, the market price for geisha, at least, I say the market price, not that it's defined by the stock exchange, but just kind of the domestic normal prices that are paid for geisha are much, much higher than everything else.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to kind of justify blending that into like an 84 point community lot or an 86 plus community lot, whatever it is. And so, like, okay, let's get creative. Like, these 3 or 4 farms are all right next to each other. They're all producing a little bit of geisha. It's all pretty good, very similar in terms of profiles, cup score. We're paying similar prices. Why not just kind of blend them together and see how that works? And I'm happy to say that it has. And it kind of is an interesting and relatively new sort of product that we can offer. It doesn't have to have...
How long have you been doing that? How long have you been blending single varietally?
I would say since almost the beginning, at least with geisha. Specifically in the case of Divino Nino, we've been working with a few different members of the Cantillo family, some of which are part of the Divino Nino group formally, some of which are not. But there's at least 4, 5, 6 producers who have farms all right next to each other. All of them have geisha. And all of them produce very, very small amounts of it. And so we're like, okay, in a different world, this is all the same farm,
Yeah, right.
So like, let's just try it. And it worked, and it worked well. I think at the first lots we exported were just labeled like Cantillo geisha. When it's like 2 or 3 of the producers, chipped in a little bit. And now that it's, a few more, we're just referring to it as the Divino Nino geisha. I think there's one producer who is like the brother-in-law of the Cantillo brothers, but doesn't have the Cantillo last name, so we can't call it the Cantillo geisha, even though he is kind of part of the family. So it just felt more appropriate to call it Divino Nino geisha. But now the same thing's happening with pink bourbon, and even more so to a degree, because pink bourbon has become so pervasive throughout South Huila, throughout Suaza, Acevedo, Pitalito, San Agustin, Palestina. It's just everywhere.
So let me ask you this, because we saw that and
Yeah.
we've noticed it, but this, okay, from my vantage point, from at least the Canadian, not even from the Canadian coffee market, because again, our other project, Boxcar, we've been sourcing other roasters' coffees for over 8 years now, and Pink Bourbon did not seem like one of those, like Geisha, where it slowly became, more producers caught on to like the potential of getting more money out of it, for better or for worse. Pink Bourbon did not feel like that. Pink Bourbon felt like like 1 year, and all of a sudden it was Pink Bourbon everywhere.
Oh,
That's not how coffee growing works. So where, what am I missing, I guess, is my question.
Yeah. So I think so. Pink Bourbon was discovered in Osito several years ago, and I think a lot of the reason that it caught on so quickly is because, one, obviously the cup quality can be fantastic, can be unreal. We saw many Pink Bourbons in the top 10 of the Copa de Occidente. Last year's Copa Suazeña winner, Pink Bourbon. We buy loads of Pink Bourbon from Pitalito and San Agustin that are always 87 plus. They're always fantastic. Yeah. But on top of that, more so than Geisha, does have some rust resistance, and the production is higher. Yeah. And so I think for a lot of people, there is, what it comes down to is economic incentive. Okay, I can get a much higher price. Production is much higher. There is resistance. It's not a super difficult plant to manage relative to geishas or tipicas or something like that.
Yeah.
So it just became something that 4 or 5 years ago people started planting in volume. And now in the last 2 years, it has just absolutely exploded.
Wow.
And so that said, like with any other variety, it's only as good as how it's processed. And so what we're finding is that, while the winner of last year's Copa Suazeña, Adriana Gonzalez, her coffee is an easy 88, grown at 2,000 meters above sea level. It is ridiculously beautiful coffee. Not everyone's Pink Bourbon is like that. I would say most are 86 plus and are good coffees. And so, but at the same time, we're also paying much higher prices for them than we are for Castillo, for example.
Right.
And so in a way, it just kind of carved a new path for something different. Okay, so we have these 86-point Pink Bourbons. Can we do something interesting with this? Can we create single variety lots from this? And for the most part, that has also been a successful thing, where apart from the super, super high scoring lots, we blend a lot of them and are now both in San Agustin and in Suaza creating these regional Pink Bourbon lots. Just a few weeks ago, we exported a 40-bag lot to Antwerp of a single variety from just a bunch of producers in Divino Niño. They're all pretty high quality, ranging, I would say, from 85.5 to 87 plus. And so it's just a really kind of cool coffee. And it helps us logistically because we don't have to deal with a bag and a half from this person, a bag and a half from that person, 2.5 bags from this person, of all very similar quality. It's in a lot of ways, it's easier to market the community than it is to market each and every single one of these tiny deliveries from these producers.
Right.
And so, yeah, I would say for that reason, we decided to kind of create this new product, which, when I say it out loud, doesn't sound all that innovative, but I don't really see it anywhere else. I don't really see a lot of people creating these single variety community lots. No. And for me, logistically, it's the only thing that makes sense.
Yeah. Very cool. Well, lastly, super interesting to hear. from your vantage point, and kind of confirms, some of our experience as well. This is a relatively novel thing, single varietal community lots. Like I said before, they're not something that we had really come across in our sourcing. So that's one of the things that made us immediately kind of curious and drawn to that project. And then obviously,
and to be clear, I think at some point we're going to see a lot of those coffees become kind of the standard offering for a lot of people, because pink bourbon is so ubiquitous now, because so many people are planting it. At least for now, it's seen as like a step above Caturra, even though Caturra obviously can be fantastic as well.
For sure.
Right now it's seen as somewhat exotic, but I think in the next couple of years, we're going to see that it's just really good coffee that's not super exotic anymore.
Yeah. I mean, that it was one thing that I, kind of quietly really liked about Freddie's first place win in the Copa de Occidente, because it wasn't pink bourbon, and I love pink bourbon. I think I've had some stunning coffees over the past 2 years, and I'm happy that there is a variety that isn't geisha, in the sense that geisha can be, I should say, a liability for producers. It is. It's difficult to grow, and it just ends up being, for the yield, resource intensive and does not always deliver. And I go further,
and they don't always get the payout that they think they're going to get.
Exactly.
They're not living under a rock. They see Cup of Excellence prices, and they're like, I'm going to get that. And for the most part, we pay very, very well for geisha, but it's not $2,000 a pound.
Again, and it depends on the number of pounds at that point, right? So, and it's much less with geisha yield wise. So, but why don't we, ending on that note of Copa de Occidente, why don't we just hear a little bit about the Copa Suazeña, and what that's about.
Yeah, so the Copa Suazeña was the first cup competition that we launched. 2019 was the first year. Coincidentally, that was also the last time I visited Colombia for a very long time due to the pandemic. So 2019 was the first year. We did a version of it in 2020. Actually, it was actually the beginning of 2021. But for the 2020 harvest season, we did it remotely. I did it in my office here in the States, and we had cuppers kind of in Colombia and different parts of the U.S. But we pulled it off, and this will coming up, in January of 2022 will be the third installment of that. And it was started just as a way to kind of cultivate a culture of high-end specialty coffee. This part of Suaza, but going back to what I said at the beginning about this group, they were somewhat disorganized, and a lot of the reason is because they had kind of buyers kind of cycle in and out, people who were not interested in working with them anymore, and it didn't really serve them to like really cultivate a culture of high-end specialty. And so we were looking for anything that would be kind of a motivational tool for them. And I would say that largely this has been massively successful. In the first year, in 2019, the winner was actually one of the founding members of the group. His name is Germán Córdoba. He won with a blend of red and yellow Tabi, which was a really, really beautiful coffee. And, in that first year, though, I would say, even across all 3 days of cupping, that particular coffee scored, I think, just above 87 on average. Which for some people, who are being told, hey, come cup some competition coffees, they think, oh man, 90-point coffees all the way around. And it's just not what it is, especially at that point. But we had some buyers who knew what to expect, and they bought it anyways. And I thought that was just beautiful. They're in it for the long term. Yeah. But even transitioning to the following year, the number of 87-point coffees we saw on average was a lot more. And that's just 1 year.
Yeah.
And so we're expecting even more this coming season. I mean, and I think a lot of the producers that we work with outside of Suaza see that and they're like, oh man, I want to do that. And so I think even this year with the first Copa de Occidente, we had a lot of 87-point coffees throughout the top 10. It wasn't minimal.
No.
And there were some phenomenal coffees. People were throwing out 89s. Like it was impressive. And I think a lot of the reason is just because they saw what was happening in this other competition. And, that was in a way motivating for them as well. And,
for sure.
And so, at this point, when we started with this group in Suaza, they were, I think, 25 producers. And they actually capped it. They said they didn't want to be more than 25 producers because they wanted to manage quality. They wanted it to be a manageable thing, and keeping it small was in their favor. But now, given the success that we've had together, given the success of the competition, they've managed to grow that now to almost 50 producers, which is awesome because we have a lot of demand for the coffee and we need more of it. But we are seeing, neighbors and other family members who are producers kind of getting pulled into the group and are now, super motivated to do really, really good work. And, I was talking to David, who, one of my colleagues, and he was talking to another buyer, I think yesterday. And the buyer was a relatively seasoned buyer. And he was like, but he didn't have a lot of great things to say about smallholder agriculture. And he's like, smallholder agriculture is a placeholder for poverty. And I was like, at first it sounds like he's just trying to insult what we do. But at the same time, I was like, no, he's absolutely right. Like, it doesn't work. The numbers don't work. But this is what we have. And I understood what he was saying better, that it was just, practically speaking, the numbers don't work.
Well, it's making it sound like there's a problem with like smallholder agriculture a priori, but it's not. There's nothing wrong with smallholder agriculture, but in the current system that exists, which is to say that instead of blaming the smallholder side, you blame the system side.
Exactly. And that's the point. Like, he wasn't necessarily blaming the producers for the situation that they find themselves in. No. But we can all hold the system accountable.
Yeah.
And but at the same time, producers can't just turn on a dime and do something else.
Exactly.
They can't just say, okay, producing coffee doesn't work. All right, I'm going to go to the city and get a good job, and they'll pay more.
Well, that's why we see it, right? I mean, like there's these economic principles that people invoke when they talk about market corrections, say. And so it'd be like, oh, there's tons of coffee and the price of coffee drops, but that'll correct itself because people will find that it's not worth it to farm coffee. But that just totally belies the like very human reality of what it means to for where you live, for how you're rooted, for what education and skills you've developed, for the fact that you have to feed maybe a family today and tomorrow. It's a strangely inhumane economical invocation that doesn't represent itself. And it's why we see coffee prices vacillate so much, because there's very little market correction. Yeah. There's very little ability in that sense. There's very little ability for people to have social mobility in that regard.
I mean, isn't it telling that the coffee price is now, $2.30, $2.35, and us here on the buying side are panicking. This is like blowing apart our whole world. And producers in Colombia are like, I'm not making any more money than I was last year when the prices were below $1. Oh, they're just so bound to this. It's not like they can tomorrow say, you know what, this isn't working. I'm going to go get a degree at the university and go get a good job. They just can't do that. No. And so this is what we have. We have smallholder agriculture. And what we can do is do our best to break down the old systems and build new ones that are better for them. Because ultimately, we as exporters and importers, we need them. Our business is me feeding my family depends on them.
Yeah.
And they have to be happy, profitable in order for us all to win.
What a great note to end on. Kyle, so grateful for your time.
No, I mean, we're so grateful for you guys. We're grateful to be a part of what you're building, and anything that we can do to support you, we are happy to do that.
Hope you enjoy your holidays.
Yes, you do the same.
And we'll catch up. We'll catch up in the new year.
That sounds great.
Hopefully, it's a bit less eventful. Amazing. Take care. We'll see you.
All right.